Grief is a natural experience that we all feel at different times in life. Grief comes to us in many forms, from loss of a pet to loss of a job to loss of a friend. Through our own grief stories, we can look at how we think and act, and in doing this we can find meaning for ourselves and our communities. Community is connection to the place and people we live with, we work with, and play with. So how do we understand what grief is? It is often a hard and complex way of coping with loss. We feel grief through different lenses, including spiritual, social, emotional, physical. Grief often impacts how we think. And there are several types of grief. There is ambiguous grief. This is a loss that does not seem to have any closure or understanding. This often results in feelings that remain unresolved and feeling stuck in limbo. Disenfranchised grief is a type of grief that cannot be understood by others and is often not accepted. Anticipatory grief is experienced prior to a loss that is coming up. Complicated grief or prolonged grief happens when those strong feelings of loss make the process of healing very difficult. And bereavement is when you experience the sadness after losing a loved one. This is not an exhaustive list by any means. One key idea is that there are many different ways to grieve. Everyone's journey is unique to them. Now it is time to think back to the last year and ask yourself, what have I lost and what has my community lost? Remember, you have several different communities, such as your school community, family, friends, your work community, and others. There are many ways to experience loss. We can even relive past loss through our current loss. And sometimes it is hard to pinpoint, as some loss is not always a physical loss. Personal loss and collective or community loss are both significant. Loss can present itself in different ways. It could be the loss of a loved one, or the loss of a job, the loss of a trusted relationship, or the loss of a community of people. There are so many different types of loss as there are stars in the sky. Grief is how we deal with loss. It is a normal reaction that helps us recognize and process loss. This is why it is imperative to validate your emotions and journey through grief. It is important to validate both your grief and the grief of others. Validation is accepting those thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in your own journey and in others. Validation does not necessarily mean approval, just acceptance. And in validating grief, we learn to accept there are different ways of coping and different paths through our grief. Some of the ways we cope can be healthy or unhealthy. As people move through the grief process in their own fashion, they can fall into two categories. One is the person who thinks through their grief and asks questions to understand. Then there are those who feel their way through grief. They need to process their grief by sharing their emotions and feelings with others. For the thinkers, you can help support them by keeping busy with them. You could work on a project together, exercise with them, or just spend quality time doing some fun activities. For the feelers, you can use great listening skills by hearing their words without trying to fix things, or support them in a group setting or connect them to a support group. And we need to see that just like anything in life, there's an ebb and flow or a back and forth. We grieve and make progress through the journey and then fall back into the struggle and then forward again. And in that back and forth, we hear about the stages of grief or states of being in the grief process. And we see these states of being are not linear. Here are some of the stages we often hear about. Denial. Denying is a protective coping mechanism, which tends to numb our feelings of loss. Anger is a strong emotion, and we can use this to mask other feelings we don't want to experience. Bargaining is a way to try and have control over our loss. And depression can lead us to isolation, confusion, and thoughts not consistent with reality. In acceptance, we can understand our loss even if our journey has not reached a conclusion. And hope is built from acceptance and helps us to understand there is a future, and we can learn something from our journey through grief and even try to help others with theirs. Here are a few things you can do to help work through your grief. First, be compassionate to yourself. Remember, there is no timeline to your journey through grief. Practice mindfulness of the moment and show yourself acceptance of where you are and how you feel. Write a letter to yourself. Let yourself know how you feel and write yourself an encouraging word. In mindfulness, learn to connect with the present. Learn to live in the experience you have at this moment. You can try using the 5 senses to ground yourself to the present. See, touch, hear, smell, taste. Keep a gratitude journal by writing out one thing you are grateful for and one person you are grateful for. Maybe even go one step further and write that person a letter or phone them and tell them why you are grateful for them. Practice daily affirmations. Write out positive statements of what you want to be like and read that to yourself twice a day. And you can make yourself a personal support map. Add in all the people, relationships, and organizations that help support you through life. The good thing is this list can keep growing and changing. And finally, there's often a way to find meaning in your grief. Our journey through grief may never truly end. Even if you can't see the meaning of your loss now, the future may bring you to that meaning. And as you find yourself in acceptance and hope, you can share your story with others to help guide them in their own journey through grief.